Remember, you can always use console.log to check the value. Okay, at this point, let's change gears. We've talked about scope. Now let's talk about context. So I'm actually going to delete all of the code that we have and start fresh. Okay, so scope is about variables. Context is about objects. So with this in mind, let's go ahead and give ourselves an example object to experiment with. So I'm going to create a variable and I'll give it a name of John and set it to equal an object, so curly brackets. Let's give it a property of first name and set it to equal John. And then let's give it another property of last name and give it a value of Doe. Okay, and then let's also give this object a method named driveCar. So driveCar, parentheses, curly brackets. And let's imagine we want this method to log out to the console a bit of text that says, John Doe is driving a car. So console.log, only we don't want to necessarily hard code John into the string of text. Instead, it would make more sense to pull in the value of the first name property, right? Because that way, if in the future they ever legally changed their name to Jonathan or something different, our driveCar method would automatically pull in that value. So the question is, inside of a method like this, right, inside this function that belongs to the object, how can we reference this property? Well, instead of just saying first name, we instead want to say this dot first name. Now, the entire topic of context in JavaScript is centered around the this keyword. I will explain how the this keyword works in just a minute, but first let's finish out our line of code here. So right after first name, let's say plus, and then a string of text with a space in it, and then let's add on their last name. So this dot last name, and then let's add on a string of text that says is driving a car. Okay, now really quick, let's test out this method, and then we can dive into really understanding the this keyword. So maybe down here at the very bottom of our code, below our object, we can say John to work with the object, look inside it with a dot, and then call that method. driveCar, parentheses to call the method, and if we check the console, awesome. We see John Doe is driving a car. Again, this is nothing new. We've done this before. The reason I'm showing it to you this time is because this is a chance to dissect the keyword this. So what in the world does this mean? Well, that's a loaded question. Even some of the best JavaScript developers in the world, if they're being honest, at one point in their career, they were definitely confused by the this keyword. So in our current example, the this keyword is pointing towards our John object. So if we use our imagination, we are basically saying John dot first name, John dot last name, right? We know that to look inside an object, you just say dot and then whichever property you're interested in. Now at this point, you might be thinking, what's the big deal? What's so confusing, right? This seems really straightforward. You might be thinking that within a method, the this keyword simply always points towards the enclosing object. However, that's not the case. So in a search for the truth, let me confuse you on purpose just for a minute to show you why the this keyword gives developers so much trouble. Check this out. Right above this console.log line, but still within our driveCar method, let's create a brand new function. So function, and let's name it I'm a function, not a method. Then parentheses, curly brackets. This name is just for fun. You could choose any function name you want, but we are nesting a function inside of this method. And check this out. Inside the body of this function, let's log out to the console the this keyword. Now, currently, this function would never actually run, right? This is just a function definition or the recipe for the function. So then maybe right below it, why don't we try and call that function? So I'm a function, not a method, parentheses to call it. And if I check the console, Right above our John Doe is driving a car, we see this window object. Let's not get too hung up on what window is. For now, I can tell you that in the web browser, window is the root or global object. We could say that it's the top level object that houses or contains all of the web browser's other objects. For now, let's just call window the global object. Now, the important concept here is that the this keyword is pointing to two different things at two different times, right? In this context, this line of code that I'm highlighting, the this keyword pointed towards our John object, but then on this line of code, the this keyword is pointing towards the global object. So, the million-dollar question, the question that confuses programmers all around the world, the question that they're ripping their hair out of their head over is, how does JavaScript decide what the this keyword should be pointing towards? Well, here's the answer. The this keyword does not point towards the enclosing object. Clearly that's not the case. If that was the case, then this instance of the this keyword would be pointing towards John, but it's not. So the real answer, here it is that the this keyword points towards the object that is executing or calling the current function. Or in other words, instead of focusing on these two lines of code that use the this keyword, so this line and this line, what we should really be focusing on are the two lines of code where we are calling the functions. So this line and this line. On this line of code, the object that is calling or executing the function is the John object. So that's the object that the this keyword is going to point towards inside that function. Now here's where the confusion comes from. You might be thinking to yourself, well, hey, this line of code lives inside that drive car function, so why on this line of code is the this keyword also not pointing towards John? Well, the answer is because that's not the context in which this function is actually being called or executed. The only reason that this function ever actually runs is because we are calling it right here. Now, on this line of code, it's painfully obvious which object is calling or executing the drive car function, or we should say the drive car method. But on this line of code, it's not as obvious, right? It's not like there's an object right in front of it and then a dot. So in cases like this, when we are calling a regular old function, JavaScript essentially says, you know what? Let's say that it's the global object that is calling or executing this function. So that's what the this keyword gets set to when the function runs. Don't worry, I do not expect you to fully grasp this yet. My only goal right now is for you to just be aware that this keyword exists, that what it points towards changes depending on the context, and that it's a source of confusion for developers of all different skill levels, not just beginners. In the future, when you are creating applications, I guarantee that you're going to run into the this keyword. And I can also guarantee that at some point, your code is not going to work the way that you want it to work. And there's a good chance that it's because the this keyword is not pointing towards what you think it's pointing towards. Don't worry, this is a concept that we can review and practice again later on in the course. Now, really quick, before we bring this lesson to a close, I want to answer the question of why. Why does the this keyword even exist? We just spent a lot of energy trying to understand how to use it, but what about why we would use it? So let's give ourselves a quick goal. Now, right now, we just have this one object named John, but imagine we had 500 other objects that represented people and cats and dogs. And imagine that we wanted to give all of those objects a method named breathe. And maybe the breathe method logs out to the console a message that says their name, and then it says they just inhaled and exhaled. Now, technically, we could just type out a function like we did for drive car, and then copy and paste it into all 500 objects, but that would be terrible code, right? That's super repetitive. So let me show you what else we can do. Maybe down here, let's create a brand new function. So function, let's call it breathe, parentheses, curly brackets. Now, if you're more experienced in programming and you're just watching these lessons as a review, you might be screaming at the screen right now, wondering why I wouldn't just use a prototype or class syntax and inheritance. But those are concepts that we have not gotten to yet in this course, so bear with me. So we've got this new function, and imagine inside it we say console.log, and then to save a bit of typing, we can literally just copy and paste the code that I'm highlighting right now. Right? So up in the drive car method, I'm going to highlight from this until the closing of the quote, and then paste that into our brand new function. And then for the ending part of the string, let's just change it to say just inhaled and exhaled. Okay, so now we've got this new function named breathe. Now, what if we wanted to let our John object use the breathe function, right? So we would expect it to say, John Doe just inhaled and exhaled. Well, at first glance, this function looks hopeless, right? Because it's a standalone function, not a method that belongs to an object. Meaning, how in the world do we expect this to point towards anything meaningful? If we tried to call or execute the breathe function down here, because it's just a regular old function, JavaScript is going to consider the global object the object that is calling it. Meaning that's what the this keyword is going to get set to, the global object. And clearly there's no first name and last name properties attached to the global object. However, check this out. Here's an example of why it's so amazing to be comfortable with the this keyword. We can begin with our breathe function, and in JavaScript, a function is an object just like any other object or entity. And functions have access to a method named call. So we can include the name of our function, and then instead of parentheses right after it to call it directly, we can say dot call, and the call method is going to call or execute our function, but not before first giving us a chance to control the this keyword. Meaning whatever we place inside these parentheses here, call will make the this keyword point towards that. So if we want our John object to be able to use the breathe function, well, this function would make a whole lot of sense if the this keyword was pointing towards John, right? So down here inside the call parentheses, let's just pass in our John object. And now if we check the console, awesome. John Doe just inhaled and exhaled. So maybe now you're starting to see the purpose of the this keyword. It allows our code to be flexible. If we had another object named Jane or meows a lot or barks a lot, we could just as easily include that here. And thanks to the this keyword, this function is flexible enough that it would still make sense and work perfectly. In the future, we will learn about other situations where you use the this keyword that are even 10 times more useful than this example. Okay, that's going to bring this lesson to a close. To be fair, you probably didn't need to know this much about scope and context this early on in your JavaScript career. I usually try to err on the side of protecting you from complicated topics early on, but really I just feel like scope and context are such a common source of confusion for developers that even if none of this makes sense right now, we at least planted these seeds in your mind. And maybe a week or two down the road, if your code is not working and you're super confused and frustrated, maybe a little light bulb will go off in your mind and you'll go, aha, maybe it's scope that's causing the problem, or maybe it's context that's causing the problem. And you might even need to come back and re-watch this lesson, but big picture, I think you're going to be happy that you learned about these topics. Cool. Now, looking ahead to our next lesson, we are going to learn about miscellaneous features of the JavaScript language that are super useful, but maybe didn't need an entire video just for themselves. So it's going to be sort of a fun grab bag of useful tips and syntax and tricks. It's going to be a much shorter lesson than this one, I promise you that. So let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson.